Distinguished colleagues, distinguished delegates, distinguished ladies, gentlemen, I now declare the second working group session of the multilateral assessment under the second round of the international assessment review process open. I warmly welcome all participants of this SBI event, and in particular the representatives of the parties that will be multilaterally assessed during this session. As was demonstrated during previous MA sessions, I am once again looking forward to the insightful and constructive interaction amongst parties. It is vital that we continue to build a strong foundation and reflect on lessons learned to provide guidance to this and subsequent sessions of MA and the IAR process as a whole. This will also build a strong foundation for the transparency framework for action and support referred to in Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. I would like to encourage all of you to refer to the Annex 2 of Decision 2 CP17 to get a comprehensive overview of the IAR modalities and procedures. Let me briefly outline the main elements of these modalities and procedures, the proposed approach for the operationalization, as well as what happened so far under this process. So, the international assessment and review process comprises two steps. First, a technical review of the national reports of each developed country party, which have been made available by the Secretariat. Second, the multilateral assessment of the progress towards achieving the economy-wide emission reduction targets by developed country parties. The multilateral assessment also entails two stages. First, a question and answer process in advance of this working group session. And second, the assessment of the parties during the working group session under the SBI. The question and answer process of the MA was launched from 1st February to 30th of April 2017. A total of 236 questions were received from 10 parties, and all parties under assessment received at least 2 questions. The compilation of questions and answers have been made available on the Multilateral Assessment Party page on the UNFCCC website. Colleagues, let me recall that according to paragraph 5 of the Annex 2 to Decision 2 CP17, the scope of the questions under this process falls under 3 broad categories. These are all emissions and removals related to its quantified economy-wide emission reduction target, assumptions, conditions, and methodologies related to the attainment of its quantified economy-wide emission reduction target, and progress towards the achievement of its quantified economy-wide emission reduction target. To maintain the integrity of the multilateral assessment process as mandated, I would like to urge parties to raise questions and make interventions during these working group sessions within this scope. To ensure effective time management of this multilateral assessment session, flexibility is envisaged in terms of the time allocated to each party under assessment depending on the number of questions they received during session. Based on the last 2 rounds of the MA, each party required around 30 minutes. Parties being multilaterally assessed will be invited to first deliver a brief presentation. This will be followed by in-session questions and answers, and I would like to urge parties to limit their questions to those that have not yet been raised or responded to during the 3-month Q&A period, and those questions raised during the 3-month period that need further clarification. In order to allow all parties an equal opportunity to ask questions, I will encourage parties to limit their questions to 3 each in the first round, and if time allows, a second round of questions from parties will be taken. I will take a block of questions from several parties at once and ask party being assessed to respond to these questions before we move on to the next round of questions. I will give the floor to parties under assessment, starting with Canada, and then proceeding in alphabetical order. Please note that Belarus will not be able to present in this multilateral assessment session, and that it will be multilaterally assessed at a later point in time. Colleagues, I have to ask you that as far as tomorrow's Saturday session is concerned, please refer to the daily program and informations that will be made available. All presenters, of course, will be presenting from their seats and using the remote control to change slides. And after the last party has been assessed, I will take up statements by parties if time permits. In addition to the party record to be prepared by the Secretariat for each party being multilaterally assessed, the procedural outcome of the MA will be captured in the SBI report of this session. Colleagues, at this time, I'm really pleased to invite Mr. Matt Jones, Director General of the Climate Policy Office, Environment and Climate Change Canada, to deliver your brief presentation. You've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As a former longtime participant in UNFCCC processes, it's a pleasure to be back in Bonn once again, and I'm particularly pleased to be here to participate in this multilateral assessment session. In Canada, feel that these exchanges through these sessions are critical for building trust, as you mentioned, amongst parties, and is an important opportunity for us to learn from one another. I can assure you that we have taken great efforts to learn from the experiences of other countries as we have developed our climate change policies over the last years. The last 2 years have been a period of intense effort and great progress in our efforts to address the issue of climate change. Internationally, we submitted our INDC, which became our NDC, which created a target of 30% below, a reduction of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Of course, this was followed quickly by the Paris Agreement, quick ratification and early entry into force of the Paris Agreement, something that Canada worked hard to support. Additionally, internationally, Canada has committed $2.65 billion to climate finance. But domestically, at the same time as we were trying to advance all of these objectives and others internationally, we were working hard to develop a comprehensive climate change plan that would allow Canada to meet its targets and its commitments and put Canada on a path for a low carbon future. So that is what I'd like to focus our presentation on this morning. In the Canadian context, the timing of our biennial report was a bit unfortunate in that many important policies were completed after the biennial report was submitted. So in Canada, as I mentioned, we have been working towards the development of a comprehensive climate change plan. It includes a number of important policies, including the creation of carbon pricing throughout the country, other mitigation policies, including the phase out of coal-fired power plants by 2030, targeted regulations pursuing emission reductions of methane, a regulatory clean fuel standard that we think will generate significant emission reductions. At the same time, we've also made quite considerable investments in promoting infrastructure, including green infrastructure, which I'll talk more about, advancing clean technologies and innovation, and targeting specific emission reductions. Along the way, while we were developing our new climate change policies, we also developed a mid-century strategy, which we released in Marrakesh. And this was an important tool for helping guide the development of our policies towards deeper reductions over the long term. And at the same time, we have made significant progress in developing a strategy to address short-lived climate pollutants. I will move quickly past these next few slides in order to limit the length of my presentation and help keep the session on track. This slide merely represents our emissions by IBC sector. The next two slides simply provide a very high-level overview of the impacts of climate change in Canada. Suffice it to say, for a northern country like Canada, the impacts are severe and varied. Most recently this week, our Environment Canada offices, along with many other government offices, were closed due to flooding of the Ottawa River in the National Capital Region, which has served as a reminder of the frequency and severity of the impacts of climate change that we are experiencing and can experience. But that is for a different presentation. Moving on to the development of the climate change plan that I mentioned. Canada is a decentralized country with 10 provinces and 3 territories. These jurisdictions have quite considerable powers, particularly over areas like energy and natural resources, and environmental policy is an area of shared jurisdiction. So clearly in the Canadian context, moving forward on an issue like climate change requires close collaboration between the levels of government. So with that in mind, the Prime Minister met with the premiers of each of those 13 jurisdictions in March in a full-day session focused on climate change. The outcome of that was something that has become known as the Vancouver Declaration. The Vancouver Declaration, for the first time, allowed us to have universal agreement and endorsement of the national target, and importantly launched 4 working groups to analyze 4 different topics related to climate change. So we have looked at carbon pricing, additional mitigation policies, adaptation policies, and clean technology and clean growth. And these working groups were mandated to evaluate every conceivable policy option that could be part of a future plan. We looked at every option, every sector, every policy tool, every technology. We looked at emission reduction potentials and costs. These reports are available online if people would like to have a look at them. And during this period, between April and October, these collective working groups, I can assure you, poured through many biennial reports and mined the online database of policies and measures pursued by other countries. The resulting working group reports really laid out a menu of options from which we drew a collection of key policies and produced what is now known as the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which was adopted at a second meeting of First Ministers convened by the Prime Minister in Ottawa. And this resulting policy package represents Canada's approach to dealing with climate change. I think it's worth noting that there have only been 2 First Ministers meetings in the last several years, and both of them focused on climate change policy. So what is this package of policies? Pan-Canadian Framework, as I mentioned, focuses on these 4 pillars of pricing carbon, additional policies, mitigation policies, adaptation, and clean technology. And it is designed explicitly to both allow Canada to meet its emission reduction obligations, but also perhaps even more importantly, transition to a lower carbon future. So I'll work through the key pieces of this policy package, starting with carbon pricing. I can tell you that carbon pricing debate has been intense in Canada going back many years. Carbon pricing does exist in 4 jurisdictions. As a result of our efforts to develop the Pan-Canadian framework, carbon pricing will exist throughout the country by 2018. Provinces and territories have the option to choose either a tax or a cap and trade system. The price will start at $10 a ton and increase by $10 a ton per year until 2022, when it'll reach $50. We will then take stock of where to from there with respect to potential future price increases. But from our perspective, the creation of consistency, of stringency and coverage, and the predictability of price increases were key elements of our approach to addressing climate change and influencing investment decisions going forward. The federal government is working to refine this approach as we move forward. In a country like Canada, there are different circumstances in different parts of the country. The needs and costs in remote off-grid communities in the north are different than in our urban centers. So we'll be looking at conducting a number of studies on the impacts on the territory specifically and with Indigenous peoples. And we'll also be looking at as I mentioned, an assessment and a take stock to confirm the path forward after 2022. Additional policies. So, as we all know, there is no one simple answer to climate change or to our efforts to reduce emissions. There are no silver bullets. Pricing carbon is certainly a core element that we consider the foundation of the plan, as it will influence investment and purchase decisions going forward. But we have also complemented that with a suite of policies targeting emissions and pursuing emission reductions in every sector of the economy. This is a very high-level summary, but electricity, we've made significant investments in support of the electricity grid to allow for greater interconnections. We have jurisdictions and regions of the country that have surplus hydro potential and we're working to ensure that that renewable energy can make it to parts of the country that are more carbon-based. We have a regulation to completely phase out the use of coal-fired electricity by 2030. Building codes are an essential policy. We are working towards net zero ready building codes for 2030. So between the coal regs and the building codes by 2030, we should have no electric generation from traditional coal-fired, and all of the new buildings built in Canada should be net zero ready. So potentially in a position to generate as much electricity as they use. Transportation is, of course, a key area of focus, as it is in many countries. We have taken a regulatory approach to vehicle efficiency standards, but we are also pursuing means for increasing the use of electric vehicles and alternative powered vehicles. Clean fuel standard is another core policy where we're trying to significantly reduce the carbon content in fuels, and I can speak more about that later. Other targeted regulations targeting methane emission reductions 40 to 45% by 25 from 2012 levels, and also HFC regulations are being developed now consistent with the Kigali Amendment. So additionally, short-lived climate pollutants, because of this package of policies, as well as our air pollution policies that have been newly created and enhanced, we feel we've made excellent progress in addressing black carbon emissions, methane emissions, ground level ozone, and HFCs, and I could certainly speak more to that if people are interested. Adaptation, I know that adaptation is not the focus of this process, but I'd like to just quickly highlight some elements of our plan, since it is one of the 4 key pillars of our approach to addressing climate change. As I mentioned, there are quite significant impacts in Canada, as there are throughout the world. couple of key policies, just to quickly highlight, the Center for Climate Services is something that we're creating to pull together information into usable formats to allow for risk assessments to be effectively carried out. Also, in our most recent federal budget, we have allocated $2 billion for disaster mitigation and an adaptation fund, which we hope will be able to reduce the severity of the impacts of climate change. Clean technology. So, as we all know, the challenge presented by climate change requires us to tap into the full potential of human ingenuity and innovation. Our approach to addressing climate change, as captured in the Pan-Canadian framework and elsewhere, relies heavily on our efforts to develop, commercialize, and deploy solutions, clean technologies and innovative approaches. And we have tried to do this in a number of different ways. So we have increased our support for research and development, but also demonstration and deployment, helping companies commercialize their potential technologies and solutions, providing access to capital, focusing in on skills, supporting Indigenous peoples. Our most recent budget has included a number of specific investments in sustainable development, in research and development for the natural resource sectors in particular, and we have also created a strategic innovation fund. Additionally, we've made quite significant investments in Canada of particular relevance to our efforts to address climate change, starting with the Low Carbon Economy Fund. This is a $2 billion fund that is to be used in conjunction with financial contributions from other levels of government to make investments directly in emission reduction projects. So we're trying to leverage this money to make strategic investments in projects that directly and materially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Green infrastructure. So there is quite a significant focus on infrastructure investments and renewal in Canada. Several of these investments, like public transit, are not necessarily greenhouse gas policies in and of themselves, but certainly will have significant emission reduction benefits. Green infrastructure is meant to target everything from emission reductions to adaptation to wastewater treatment. When it comes to mitigation, a focus on transmission grids, connectivity, support for renewables, alternative sources of energy, reducing reliance on diesel generation, et cetera, will be a particular focus, and we hope and we expect will have a particularly important and lasting effect on our GHG emissions profile. And as mentioned a moment ago, investments in clean technology in the last budget totaled approximately $2.2 billion. So progress towards our target. The 2020 target is challenging. I think it's much less challenging currently than it was in the past. If you've been following our past reports, whether they're inventory reports or our past bilateral reports, you will see that our emissions and our projected emissions have been coming down. There are many new policies, several of which I have touched upon so far, but additionally there are some important policies at provincial and territorial levels that are contributing to emission reductions. And collectively, we are now focused on implementing these policies in a timely way so that we can maximize the emission reductions achieved in the near term so that we can make greater progress towards our 2020 target. With respect to our 2030 target, as I mentioned, there's a large collection of policies. I've only mentioned some of them. They're collectively, the ones that we have modeled thus far are collectively expected to reduce Canada's total emissions by 175 megatons from our previous projections to 2030. It's important to note that that figure only represents the policies that have been modeled so far. So investments in things like public transit and green infrastructure, the investments in the Low Carbon Economy Fund have not been modeled yet because we have not yet done call for proposals or collected the specific project proposals and the details attached to them, we have not estimated emission reductions from them. So while we don't yet know how many reductions we will achieve from investments in clean technology, infrastructure, public transit, a low carbon economy fund, et cetera, we're certain that we will get potentially significant emission reductions from them. Additionally, we've not yet included potential increases in stored carbon, and the 175 figure also presumes no additional policies at any level of government between now and 2030, which we don't expect to be the case. So this line graph merely represents the emission reductions that I've just walked through. From a 2030 perspective, our emissions not so long ago were projected to be 815 megatons. Our more recent projections in 2030 has brought that down to 742 as a result of a collection of measures, many of them at the provincial level, the Pan-Canadian framework, the policies that have been modeled. The 175 megatons brings us down to 567. Our target is 523, and as mentioned, there is a collection of policies that have either not been modeled, that we feel will more than close the remaining gap. We've had our 2020 target in mind and our 2030 target, as well as we have been developing these policies, but we have also had at the top of our minds the cycle of emission reduction requirements created by the Paris Agreement, the regular cycle of submitting new NDCs and driving ever deeper reductions towards achieving the 2 degrees and even 1.5 degree goals means that we have to put a particular emphasis on policies that put us on a path to much deeper reductions. So we have attempted to do this through a number of means. Our policies, we feel, don't just enable us to meet that target, but really provide the foundation for deeper reductions longer term. We've tried to put an emphasis on investments that will drive deeper reductions. Building codes are a good example that potentially will not provide significant reductions by 2030, but going forward have the potential to put us on a much better trajectory. Similarly, a number of our policies have been designed to be scalable in order to allow for greater improvements over time. Associated with this, we've put in place a lot of monitoring and reporting processes to allow us to continually take stock and successfully move forward with this cycle of ever more stringent targets and ever greater emission reductions. So in addition to all of our UNFCCC reporting, we report to Parliament on the status of our departmental objectives. We also will be reporting to the Prime Minister and to the Premiers annually on the state of implementation and the progress achieved. We also have included processes for engaging with Indigenous peoples and seeking advice from external experts. Very quickly on this topic of the 2.65 billion, just picking up on the developments since the biennial report, $841 million in new contributions have been allocated. This is a little outside the scope of our process, so I'll skip over to the next slide, the long-term strategy. So I mentioned earlier that we had, while developing the Pan-Canadian framework, been working to develop a long-term mid-century strategy with a focus on different scenarios for getting to deeper reductions, such as 80% or more reductions by 2050. And this has been an extremely helpful process, and that has provided a bit of an illustration and a longer-term endpoint that we could move back from. So key factors identified in this strategy as presented in Marrakesh: the need for non-emitting electricity, the potential for electrification downstream, including vehicles, low carbon fuels, energy conservation and efficiency gains, et cetera, et cetera. You will see that the policies that we've described in the Pan-Canadian framework are very much linked with this longer term vision of transition to a lower carbon economy. So we have attempted to focus in on electricity through a number of means, both on the generation side, on the transmission and the demand as well. Low carbon, we have a new clean fuel standard that is currently under development. Energy efficiency, one cannot have a renewables-based electricity system or energy system or economy that is not efficient. So we have a very significant focus on energy efficiency programs. Afforestation, of course, is important, particularly for a country like Canada. And we have put a particular emphasis, as I mentioned earlier, on short-lived climate pollutants. So in conclusion, the Pan-Canadian framework, we have tried to look at all aspects of this issue. We have tried to have a maximally broad scope. We've tried to look at adaptation, clean technology, innovation, mitigation. We've looked at all sectors. We've looked at all policy tools. We have worked across all of government. This is led by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, but ministers responsible for portfolios like energy, natural resources, industry, Indigenous affairs, and many others are partners in this, including the Department of Finance, and under the leadership of the Prime Minister. I think the Pan-Canadian framework I'd like to note is noteworthy also for how it was developed. It was developed in collaboration with other levels of government. It was also developed in close cooperation with the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And we've, despite the compressed time frame to pull together a package of policies of this magnitude, we have attempted to engage with Canadians, with stakeholders, and I could speak more about our extensive engagement efforts over the last year. So we've been trying to drive reductions, as I mentioned, not just for the sake of achieving our targets, but with the longer goals in mind. So in terms of next steps, we are now we've shifted our focus from developing these policies and seeking agreement on them to implementing these policies. In fact, my office has been changed. Up until a week ago, it was the Climate Policy Office. It is now the Climate Policy Implementation Office, and we are focused on driving forward with all of these measures. There are over 50 new measures in the Pan-Canadian framework across those 4 pillars, and that implicate 13 different departments. And we are making excellent progress on the regulatory side in particular. We've released a discussion paper on the clean fuel standard, and consultations are actively underway. Regulations on methane and HFCs are in advanced states of development, as is the proposed amendment to our coal-fired electricity regulation. We're working very actively with provinces on carbon pricing and are working on producing a new consultation document that should be out soon. And we are working on legislation to implement the benchmark for carbon pricing. So going forward, as I mentioned, extensive requirements for review, monitoring, and reporting. And we look forward to bringing forward the 7th National Communication and the 3rd Biennial Report by January 1st. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for such a impressive presentation of the Canadian Biennial Report. Colleagues, I didn't want to try to make your presentation shorter, but in general, what we have foreseen was like 15 to 20 minutes. So that was a little bit longer, but I think that nobody will complain. I now open the floor for your questions, and then we'll ask our speaker. I can see the EU, and I think it's India. Yeah. So the EU, India, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Germany, Brazil, and China. Okay, so this is our first round. We start from the EU. EU was the first.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to see us all here And I'm really happy that we are in a different setting maybe from what we're used to, and I'm glad to see that we are face to face with each other. So thank you, Secretariat, for organizing this nice room for us today. And yes, thank you, Canada, for a very nice presentation, maybe longer than the past, but it was very useful because it really helped clarify a lot maybe of our questions that we had before. And yes, you have presented much information on the Pan-Canadian framework on green growth and climate change. So it's a useful input for this discussion that we will have this morning, I believe. Our question is maybe related to what you have presented, but maybe it's useful to go a bit into more details, because in the information that you had provided in the biannual report and the projections that were there, there was still room for Canada to implement policies to help achieve the 2020 target. The emissions in the projection in the biannual report would show that Canada was not yet on track to reach the target. So maybe you can elaborate a bit more on how you believe that implementation of policies and measures and current put in place would actually ensure that you would meet the target for 2020. Maybe you have a bit of information on planned or effects of policies for 2020. It will be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next questions come from India.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, I congratulate the distinguished delegate from Canada for giving a very brilliant presentation, especially the low carbon strategy that is to achieve the Paris goal of 30% reduction from 2005 levels. That has to be gauged, I believe. In terms of Canada's increase of 6% in emission from 2020 to 2030 and an increase of 8.11% from 2005. Having said that, Mr. Chairman, our two small questions, more out of curiosity, are that the fourth section of the report mentions about the institutional arrangements in place for achieving the Copenhagen targets. Could Canada please provide a quantified measure towards the target? And understandably, Chair, Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec have cap and trade programs which are planned to be linked as per the BR. Has the potential for carbon mitigation from these markets been quantified? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And questions from Luxembourg, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Thomas. Good morning, colleagues. As well, also thank you, Canada, for this very comprehensive presentation. Well done. We are always very impressed at small ones, how larger colleagues are able to do. But having said that, we would be very interested if Canada could provide a little bit more insights on best practices and lessons learned in relation to the implementation of the policies. And also in this respect, also a little bit focus on which policies have proved most successful and contributed most to the emission reductions achieved so far. And last but not least, how would these policies continue to achieve even further reductions to ensure that targets are really met? So a little bit on focus. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have altogether 9 countries. So I divided 3, and 3 countries asked the question. So maybe now time for Canada to briefly respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the questions. maybe starting with the last in terms of which policies have been the most successful to date and what lessons we have learned from this process. I think that we have a long list of policies, both that are in place and that are to be put in place. I think the most significant policies we feel are the carbon pricing emissions in terms of emission reductions, but followed by, or in the same order of magnitude with the coal-fired emissions regulation. That's in 2 phases. So we had an existing regulation to phase out coal-fired power plants that had a specific formula for determining the end of life of a coal-fired power plant. We're in the process now of amending that regulation to accelerate that coal phase out. So both of those have made significant contributions to our projected emission reductions. The targeted methane regulations and the HFC regulations, we're pursuing quite significant reductions, 40 to 45% reductions in methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, which is our largest source of emissions, so quite significant. The Clean Fuel Standard is pursuing life cycle reductions in the order of potentially 30 megatons, which is quite significant. In terms of lessons learned, I think there are many that we have learned from others. So one is on how these policies are developed, and I think the need to engage collaboratively with key partners and stakeholders has obviously been a key for designing good policy and achieving buy-in to support them. Beyond that, I think flexibility to minimize cost has been important, although it's worth noting that the more flexibilities there are, sometimes the more difficult it is to implement policies. We are really just entering the implementation phase now, and we've actually been looking to other countries to learn from them on the process so far and what lessons have been learned. But those are some of the key lessons learned are really around the engagement, the minimization of costs, and having the right policy for the right source of emissions. So each circumstance is unique, and we've tried to use the right policy tool to pursue the most efficient and effective approach. Lastly, one thing that I think has been an important consideration for us and will continue to be going forward is the need to have sort of synergistic relationships between the different policies. So to advance clean technology, for example, it's not enough to simply support research and development, but we're trying to create demand. So carbon pricing and other regulatory measures can create the demand for those, pull for those policies so that we can achieve sort of maximum effect. Turning to the question of our 2020 target, yes, as I mentioned, it is a challenging target. We have made progress in recent years, and I think we will be in a better position to take stock on the situation in our next biennial report. Our focus right now is on speedy implementation of our existing policies so that they can generate emission reductions as quickly as possible. I think we have, as I've tried to outline, a long list of policies, some of which were chosen based on their ability to deliver short-term emission reductions. Some policies I didn't mention explicitly include energy efficiency programs being scaled up, which can drive emission reductions quickly. There have been other changes to the tax code to help support deployment of existing technologies like geothermal energy. Those were chosen specifically for, those are just 2 examples, to drive emission reductions. Turning to the question about the emissions trading systems. So Ontario and Quebec have emissions trading systems linked with the WCI initiative, linked with California. Manitoba had intended to at one point and has chosen not to. There's been a change of policy direction within the jurisdiction of Manitoba. Ontario and Quebec, I believe, both have legislated targets longer term within that system, within the WCI, and I believe they're driving towards 55 megatons of reductions by 2030. I think I've covered the questions. If I haven't, please remind me.
Okay, thank you very much. I have now New Zealand, Switzerland, and Germany. New Zealand, you got the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, colleagues. It's great to be back in this multilateral assessment and also to be in this room around a big round table, which I think and I hope is more conducive to an exchange of views. My question to Canada relates to a comment that was made in the review report of the biennial report by the expert review team. And I am just following up on that. So I'm wondering if Canada could please provide us with information on the key factors and activities that have influenced and will continue to influence emissions from the agriculture and transport sectors for the years 1990 to 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Switzerland, please.
Thank you, and thank you to Canada for its presentation. The review report on Canada's second biennial report notes that Canada's ability to achieve its target will depend, inter alia, on future changes in the national economy, in particular the oil and gas industry. In its answer to a question raised by China in writing, but also in its presentation today, Canada highlights the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change as a foundation for stimulating transition to a low-carbon economy. As we understand it, this framework has a clear focus on regulation. And our question is thus, are there any other policy instruments accompanying it to foster acceptability, for example, by raising stakeholder awareness for national development perspectives and prosperity models compatible with a low-carbon economy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in this round, Germany.
Yeah, good morning and thank you. Thank you, Canada, for your comprehensive presentation. You presented about the engagement of stakeholders in the Pan-Canadian network. Could Canada please elaborate a little bit more on how the stakeholders engaged in the various steps taken to develop, implement, and track progress of policies? And what are the key success factors and lessons learned in the development of these national arrangements and for the policy evaluation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Canada, you've got the floor. Please answer those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right, so maybe we'll start with the question about transportation and agriculture. These are two key sectors, I think, for most countries and certainly for Canada. Our approach for dealing with emissions from the transportation sector is somewhat varied. We had traditionally relied on regulatory measures for fuel economy for light and heavy duty vehicles, which have been updated regularly, and we've done our best to keep pace with the improvements in technology, which have allowed us to drive down the stringency of those regulations. And I think we're projecting quite a dramatic difference in terms of fuel economy between now and in the coming years compared to past performance. Additionally, I think as many countries have experienced, even if you're able to achieve reductions in kilometers driven per vehicle, as we have in Canada fairly significantly, the vehicle fleet has grown, which is puts pressure on your ability to drive deep reductions, absolute reductions in the transportation sector, because you're working against a trend that is difficult to overcome. So we have been focusing in on trying to up the deployment of zero emissions vehicles. We're currently developing a zero emissions vehicles strategy. Our focus on infrastructure is also heavily skewed towards public transit as a means to reduce the number of vehicles in the fleet and the kilometers driven. So the combination of carbon pricing, regulatory standards, infrastructure investments, particularly in public transit, and investments in support of alternative fueled vehicles, we're hoping are collectively going to be able to allow us to drive some deeper reductions in that sector. With respect to agriculture, the main sources of emissions are emissions from livestock and from fertilizers. The agriculture sector has proven of late a difficult sector to drive deeper reductions in, partially because we feel we've made some significant gains in the past. So significant efforts have been made to promote alternative feeds, no-till agriculture, reduced agricultural burning, and so forth. And we find that the remaining emissions are more difficult to get at, as I think other countries have as well. But we are working now on a new comprehensive agricultural policy framework, which will have a significant climate and sustainability component to it. And we're hopeful that we can drive greater reductions both through soil sequestration, but also reducing emissions from on-farm activities. Turning now to the second question, which was more about policies to increase, if I understood correctly, increase the acceptance and moving beyond simply regulatory measures. We're acutely aware that one of the limiting factors for how fast and how far any country and any government can go in reducing emissions is maintaining public acceptance, and this is something that needs to be recognized and taken into consideration while developing policies. So we have applied a number of different policy tools beyond regulatory measures. We've tried to make significant investments, as I mentioned, in infrastructure and in emission reduction projects so that people can see the benefits of the direct benefits of emission reduction efforts. The Low Carbon Economy Fund is one such policy. We also have a number of policies that are targeting more the general public. So we have a policy to label the energy efficiency of homes so that people can have a better understanding when buying and selling homes what the energy performance of their home is. We also have other policies targeting industry to help them adopt energy efficiency systems and management systems to reduce emissions and to generate savings as a result. And on the adaptation side, certainly people are really very quickly understanding the costs and impacts of climate change for them and have been very supportive of some of our new policies around reducing the impacts of climate change on Canadians. And clean technology writ large, I think we don't see the approach to climate change as being sharing of burden. We see it as finding of solutions and applying them efficiently. And we feel that there's a lot of opportunity for co-benefits to be achieved in terms of other environmental goals, but also in terms of economic activity and job creation and so forth. So turning lastly to the question around engagement and engagement with the public. So this has been a particularly important focus, but also a challenging one given our time frame. So we've tried to develop the most comprehensive policies we could under a very compressed time frame and to engage everyone as much as possible in the process, which made for a busy year. We've tried to adopt a number of different approaches for doing that. We have had targeted face-to-face meetings with stakeholders. Stakeholders are engaged in every step of the process. We've used online and other social media campaigns as well. We had an online portal, Let's Talk Climate Change, which we received 13,000 comments and proposals. So individuals were sending, both organizations from industry associations to individual Canadians were sending in proposals for what they thought would be particularly useful policies to build into the pan-Canadian framework. Within our regulatory processes, we have quite a regimented process for engaging stakeholders. We've also published discussion documents and other things. We've tried to be as transparent as possible in engaging people. So it has been a challenge, but it's something that we're quite committed to, and I think we've found great benefits both in terms of helping to inform the design of our policies, but also helping to increase the buy-in for them. So I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you very much. And final questions from Brazil, China, Australia, and Saudi Arabia. Brazil, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, distinguished delegates. Before going to the questions to Canada, the Brazilian delegation would like to join to European Union, and thank you for providing, and the Secretariat as well, for providing this more friendly setting in the roundtable format. Maybe I could say that the FSV informed the multilateral assessment in terms of setting, because it had this kind of more friendly interaction during the FSVs. But I'd just like to thank you very much, Canada, for the presentation. I have questions on carbon pricing in the LULUCF sector. Regarding carbon pricing, I would like to know how the carbon price has been set and what kind of economic instruments has been considered to set the carbon price, considering carbon taxation, market mechanisms, and regarding the pre-2020, if you consider the existing mechanisms, regarding 2030, if you are considering the incoming market mechanisms. Regarding the carbon pricing already, regarding units, I'd just like to know if the units regarding the gas, you refer to tons, but it's not clear if it's tons of CO2 in mass or if it's tons of CO2 equivalent. And if it's this CO2 equivalent, I'd just like to know what common metrics has been used, GWP or GTP. Regarding the LULUCF sector, Canada stated that regarding the pathway to Canada 2030 targets, potential increases in stored carbon in forests, soils, and wetlands could also make an important contribution to meeting Canada's 2030 targets. Regarding 2020, in the written phase, Canada stated that decided not to include information on the contribution of LULUCF to its targets or projections in its BR2, as work was still underway to improve the methodology to develop estimates. I'd just like to kindly request Canada to elaborate a little bit more on this improvement of methodologies regarding LULUCF. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the next is China, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the comprehensive presentation by Canada. And it's really appreciated to see the adaptation information I introduced here. Thank you very much. And thanks for your answers on the written questions about the next steps arrangement. And our question here is, apart from the pan-Canadian framework, are there any other additional measures would you take into consideration at the national level as well as on the subnational level to help to achieve the 2020 target? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Australia, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, colleagues. And can I also join my European and Brazilian colleagues in expressing appreciation for this very friendly setting for the multilateral assessment, and also Canada for the very comprehensive presentation. I have two questions. Firstly, noting Canada's federated structure and that many Canadian provinces have plans to expand renewable energy capacity, what policies exist at the federal level to encourage the uptake of renewables? And secondly, and this is more sort of related to assumptions and conditions and methodologies related to the attainment of Canada's targets, when preparing mitigation estimates for different policies and measures, how do you take into account the interaction between these policies and measures and their impact on projections? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Saudi Arabia, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Canada for their comprehensive presentation. We would like to ask Canada if they did encounter the difficulty in reporting on its assessment of the economic and social consequences of response measures in their BARs and the national communication. Will Canada be providing information on the assessment in their next BR?
Thank you very much. Canada, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, an interesting collection of topics there, so I'll try to make sure I hit every topic. Maybe I could start with the LULUCF accounting question. So you're absolutely right that Canada did choose to not include specific projections there based on the fact that we were updating our methodologies. As you may know, we have had wild fluctuations in the numbers based on natural disturbances, and we have been working towards developing a policy or an approach that will allow us to isolate, to more effectively isolate the human-induced impacts on forests. So we've developed an approach that will allow us to break the forest into individual tree stands and then isolate the ones for which the natural disturbances dominate and remove those in order to focus in on the stands for which human activity is the most prevalent consideration. So we have we're pursuing this approach, and we'll have, I think, as a result, a more useful set of numbers that will have a better will put us in a position to better understand what the human effects are going forward. So we could certainly talk more about that offline, as I'm not the LULUCF expert. But turning to the next question on let's see, what should we do next? The carbon pricing policies and how the targets were set. So this was a difficult process for us because carbon pricing already existed in Canada in 4 provinces. So we have Ontario and Quebec, who are pursuing a cap and trade program. You have the province of British Columbia, which had a carbon tax, and you have the province of Alberta that has a bit of a hybrid pricing model. So it was not a blank page for us. And as I mentioned at the outset, there is, provinces have moved quickly on climate change and have implemented some very substantive policies. And it is not our objective as the federal government to disrupt that good work, but rather to make our policies fit within that existing framework. Hence our approach of setting the benchmark. We tried to set it as ambitiously as we could to drive greater emission reductions and greater stringency over time, but to give provinces the choice of which policy tool they choose to pursue, and to not disrupt in years 1 and 2 the existing systems. So that we started with a low price, and we have escalated it from there in a predictable way. A lot of analysis and modeling and engagement with experts, including the Eco-Fiscal Commission and many other reputable organizations, were called upon to help inform those difficult decisions. In terms of our emission reduction numbers, I believe all of our numbers are in CO2 equivalent using the IPCC global warming potentials, but I'll triple check that. In terms of the question on if we were considering additional policies or measures at either the national or the subnational level to achieve the 2020 target, at the federal level, excuse me, right now we are focused on, having just developed over 50 new policies, we are very focused on implementing those policies, and to do so in a timely way so that they can have maximum effect between now and 2020. And as I mentioned, some policies were prioritized based on their ability to deliver short-term emission reductions. It's important to note also that not all of the policies that have been announced within Canada are reflected in our projections yet. There is a bit of a lag effect there where policies have to be sufficiently advanced and sufficient detail needs to be available in order to model them effectively. So there are policies that have been announced that have not been completely integrated into the model, as I understand. So that said, I can't speak for the provinces and territories. I know that there has been great leadership from them on the issue of climate change, that they're continuously working on their policies. Some very significant policies have been introduced over the last year in a number of provinces and territories. We expect more to come, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to fully achieve our 2020 target. Renewables and right. Yes, so renewables are certainly a key element of our approach to addressing climate change. We've come at this a number of different ways. So there are regulatory policies that I mentioned, the coal phase out. There's also a performance standard that we're working on for natural gas that will create some space for renewables. We have also carbon pricing obviously will skew the investment decisions going forward. We've put significant resources into the electricity grid and smart grids and storage in order to allow for the grids to better accommodate the increase in the share of renewable sources. I feel like I'm forgetting several things. Important investments in research and development and commercialization of clean technologies. I think, and then investments in grid connectivity, which will allow for greater use of renewable hydro and other large-scale renewables. So that is the quickest list of our supports for renewables. Oh, one last one, sorry. Diesel. Diesel in the north. Standalone diesel generators are used in remote communities throughout Canada, and we've allocated over $200 million in the most recent budget to facilitate movement off of diesel for a number of reasons. We think this is an important policy to reduce emissions and to reduce the black carbon and air pollution impacts of diesel generators as well. So that's another area where we're trying to promote renewable alternatives to a carbon-based source. Turning to the impacts of response measures, this is something that Canada takes seriously in terms of evaluating our policies. We're quite rigorous in the evaluation of our policies, particularly regulatory policies, in terms of identifying potential impacts on firms and on the economy. Our regulatory measures are always accompanied when they're published as drafts by something called a regulatory impact assessment statement that evaluates the impacts of our regulations, both in terms of their costs and benefits and their emission reduction potentials, but also breaks down the impacts on companies, regions, industries, trade flows, et cetera. So we are certainly working on this, and this is something that we could do a better job of in our final reports going forward. I think the last question, and the chair can correct me if I've missed any, was on the question related to how we take into account interaction effects between our policies. This is an important question. We have a rather sophisticated economic model, integrated model known as the E3MC model. We run our policies as a package so that we can identify the impacts and the cross impacts between policies. When we're developing a collection of policies, as we have for the Pan-Canadian framework, it is not sufficient to look at any policy in isolation. So we have used models that allow us to run them as a batch to understand the impacts, both economic and environmental, as a whole. So I could speak more about that, but I feel like it's been a very long answer already, so my apologies.
Okay, thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, well, that concludes consideration of during this session of Canadian presentation. Thank you very much, Canada. Congratulations. Well, let me also note that we have just consumed this additional half an hour thanks to the absence of Belarusian colleagues. So now we are going to be very strict with time. So we're moving to Cyprus. I'm inviting Theo Messimeris, the head of Climate Action Unit, to present presentation of Cyprus. And please, Theo, be brief.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to do my best. Good morning to everybody. I will give this presentation on behalf of Cyprus, a country member state of European Union. Allow me first, before going to my presentation, to mention that Cyprus welcomes the multilateral assessment and looks forward to an open, transparent, and forward-looking process aimed to building trust among all parties through enhancing transparency of action. Multilateral assessment process shows the strong benefits of transparency and of a robust reporting and monitoring system applicable to all. In my presentation, I will briefly present the EU national emission reduction target, the national policies and measures that we are taking, the progress made towards the national emission reduction target, and I will mention the questions that we have received and the answers that we have given. Only 2 questions we have received. Regarding the EU national emission reduction target, I would like to mention first that Cyprus until 2012 was a non-Annex 1 party. Therefore, Cyprus is having for the first time legally binding commitments to reduce CO2 emissions from 2013 and forward. For the second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol, the EU, its 28 member states and Iceland, including Cyprus, have inscribed a commitment of reducing average annual emissions by 20% during the 2013-2020 period as compared to base year to be fulfilled jointly. In order to achieve our EU common target, we have adopted the EU climate and energy package. The effort is divided between the EU emissions trading system and the non-ETS sectors. The effort sharing decision sets binding annual emissions allocation for each member state for the sectors not covered by the ETS. The target for Cyprus is 5% reduction regarding the non-ETS emissions. The target covers mainly emissions from transportation, buildings, small business and services, agriculture, and waste. In order to achieve our national commitments, we have introduced a number of policies and measures in the main sectors of our economy. Of course, we have a very comprehensive legal framework in order to support this effort. In the energy sector, we are planning to import and use of natural gas for electricity production, the further promotion of renewable energy sources, the further promotion of energy savings in buildings, and the further promotion of biomass and alternative fuels in the industry. Regarding the F-gases, we have already adopted the appropriate legal framework for F-gases recovery and leak checks. In the transport sector, we are promoting public transportation and low CO2 vehicles. Furthermore, we are promoting appropriate management for all waste sources, mainly in the agriculture and for the domestic waste. Now, let's see the progress made towards the national emission reduction targets. We have recorded that Cyprus policies and measures are delivering results. CO2 emissions reductions since 2005 can be attributed to reduced energy intensity of the economy, reduced carbon intensity of energy use, and of course, the economic recession. Regarding the decoupling emissions from economic growth, we have reduced emissions since 1990, and we have decoupled emissions from economic growth. The Cyprus GDP growth for the period 1990-2015 is 19%, while the Cyprus emissions increased by only 50% during the same period. According to our projections, existing measures will take us to 35 below 1990 levels, and this does not include additional measures that Cyprus is taking. In this graph, you can see that Cyprus is on track to reach its target for 2020. The orange color line of the graph represents the national target for emission reduction in the non-ETS sectors. As you can see, our relative reported and projected emissions based on the business as usual scenario that are presented with green and dark green color are well below the orange line. Regarding our projections for emissions, we have run 3 scenarios. The business as usual scenario, the scenario without measures, the scenario with measures, and with additional measures. As you can see, we can say that all scenarios prove that we have significant reductions of emissions. Concluding, we can say that Cyprus is on its way to meet its national emission reduction target. Finally, I would like to inform you about the questions that we have received and the answers that we have given during the assessment. We have received 2 questions. The first question was about AEA surplus, and in our answer, we mentioned that no transactions of AEAs accrued and none are planned in the near future. And the second question that we have received was about a noticeable emission drop in the year 2018. And in our answer, we explained that in 2018, we expect the use of natural gas in the electricity production. Moreover, in 2018, additional measures are considered in the field of energy, and these measures are the main cause for the emission drop in 2018 with the scenario with additional measures. Before closing, I would like to mention that Cyprus has already ratified Paris Agreement, and now we are preparing the appropriate national plan in order to achieve our commitments to reduce CO2. At the same time, we have finalized our adaptation strategy, and we expect soon to be adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for making the presentation very brief. Yeah. Okay, are there any questions that the colleagues would be willing to raise? Well, we were a little bit beyond of time, but yeah, okay. Thank you, Saudi Arabia. So at least something.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for Cyprus for this excellent and very brief presentation. Just to elaborate our maybe further requests for clarification on this issue of reduction on using alternative fuel sources for the power generation, if they can give us some feedback on whether this is also having economical impacts or connections and connectivities. If you can give us a bit more elaboration on economic and environmental issues of this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody else willing to ask the question, so please answer the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. One of the challenges, apart from achieving our CO2 emissions, is to establish the appropriate management system for waste. So in this effort, we have managed to have the appropriate management procedures for mainly the biomass waste, and having this management system in place, we are achieving also our targets for CO2. So it's a management system for waste that support also our effort for reducing emissions. And of course, the economics of doing this effort is in favor for this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we have time for the second round of questions. I don't see anybody willing to ask any questions, so thank you very much, Cyprus. This is the conclusion of your multilateral assessment, and we are now moving to France. And I would like to invite Mr. Laurent Michel, General Director for Energy and Climate in the Ministry of Environment, Energy and the Sea, to deliver a brief presentation. France, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, distinguished delegates. It's our great pleasure to be here, to meet you here in Bonn, since transparency is a very important issue, and we would like to underline our engagement in this process. And it's very useful for us. And for instance, we received 23 written questions on targets, policies, measures, and so on. So just before starting, going into detail of targets and policies, just to recall that France within the European Union represents nearly 30% of the European population. We emit 457 million tons CO2 equivalent, less than 7 tons per capita, which is significantly under the European average. Whereas regarding energy consumption, we are around the average. So the framework, as Cyprus said, we belong to the European Union. So first of all, we have European targets under the Convention for European Union and its member states. We have a target of minus 20% by 2020 compared to 1990. And at the European level was first adopted some years ago, the 2020 European Energy and Climate Package, with targets for the ETS, covering most industry and electricity production, and the effort sharing decision, which was minus 10% in comparison to 2005, covers buildings, transport, agriculture, waste. And this target of 10% is shared between member states, and as far as France is concerned, our target for 2020 is minus 14% in comparison to 2005 for those sectors. But we are also committed for 2030 and 2050. At the European level, the NDC communicated under the Paris Agreement, if the European Union and its member states are committed to a binding target of at least 30% domestic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, compared to 1990. And at national level, in the Law for Energy Transition and Green Growth, adopted in August of 2015, just before the Paris COP, we have introduced in our legislative framework targets for 2030, minus 30% of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which is our national framework, which is a target which is a little more ambitious that would be our mathematical part of the European target. And for 2050, the reduction will be 75%. These long-term targets are now enshrined in the French National Low Carbon Strategy, which has been finalized by Mrs. Ségolène Royal, our Minister for Environment, Energy and the Sea, in November 2015, and which has been transmitted to the UNFCCC as our long-term strategy. I will give some more details on this low-carbon strategy in the coming minutes. Last slide on the framework, on our present status. We can see that we have achieved some first results on decoupling of GHG emissions from population and economic growth. For instance, you'll see on the charts, the GHG emissions have been reduced per capita from 9.4 to a little less than 7 tons per capita from 1990. And regarding GHG emission intensity compared to GDP, the reduction is 43% over the period. But of course, we have to go further, and that's why we have defined targets and policy goals and policy measures. The law has been debated in 2014-2015 by our minister, Mrs. Royal, at the Parliament, and adopted in August 2015. It sets both transversal targets for energy efficiency, renewable, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also sectorial targets, renovation of buildings, introduction of renewables, transportation, for instance. And also it has a specific target for our overseas territories. The law is comprehensive. It's a comprehensive action plan regarding all sectors, circular economy, energy production and consumption, building sector, transportation sector, and also the policy of air quality and the policy of safety for nuclear electricity. And also it has a part of the law is dedicated to the work with subnational authorities and their possibility of action. The targets are, so as was said, 40% less greenhouse gas emission in 2030, 30% less fossil fuel consumption in 2030 compared to 2012. It's an increase of the renewable share energy sources to 42% in 2030, and among them 40% of the electricity production will be renewable in 2030. And we have also some sectorial targets, such as waste reduction of production and a better valorization, which will lead to 50% less waste in landfill by 2025. Also was introduced in the law as a tool of the carbon price. The law fixes a target of 56 euros per ton in 2020 and 100 euro in 2030. And it's been now transcribed each year in the finance law. Each year the price of carbon gets higher. Now the price for 2017 is 30.5 euros. So this trajectory aims at orientate investors to long-term horizons and low-carbon investments. Regarding finance, the law has also paved the way for reporting for companies, banks, and insurances to report how their investment portfolio are affected by climate change and how they are oriented to climate change mitigation. Last point on finance, we are just finishing what we call the second plan for investment for the future, which has dedicated 2.3 billion euros to energy transition, and the third plan has been voted and will start this year, also with a big part of our innovation plan dedicated to low carbon economy. Just some words now on our governance process. The law has decided that we establish a national low carbon strategy and that we review it regularly. And it's a set of comprehensive measures, both transversal and sectorial, and also it's linked with carbon budgets for periods of 5 years. The strategy adopted in 2015 goes up to 2028, and now we have just started the revision of the low carbon strategy. It will end at the end of 2018. We will review our ambitions and measures, and we will add another carbon budget and go up until 2033. And also this strategy, the revision of this strategy will allow us to have a deeper thought and new measures to the long-term perspective towards carbon neutrality towards the second half of the century. And so you have here the illustration of the carbon budgets which have been adopted. Some examples, the content of the law, it's a set of compulsory measures about the uncertainty frameworks in the different sectors. Regarding energy production and consumption, We've established also a 10 years program, which is called the Multi-Year Energy Program, which will also be reviewed every 5 years. And next year we will review it, and it gives orientations for energy efficiency, renewables developments, biofuels, and also sustainable mobility. We can also say that we've created a new framework for renewables, to support renewables in connection with the European guidelines, with introduction of the supplementary payment framework. And also our minister, Mrs. Royal, introduced call for tenders with a fixed framework for each year. We have very precisely defined, and it stays the same for 3 years, the amount of renewables we want to promote in each sector, windmills, PV, biomass, and so on, in order to give visibility to investors. Regarding building, we have both new regulations. For instance, binding thermal renovation has to be made when you undergo big works in existing buildings. You are compelled, for instance, when you renovate your pavement or your roofs, you are compelled to make renovation works. We've also signed and published yesterday a decree which introduces new obligations for office and tertiary buildings, such as public buildings, schools, and also private buildings, such as shops, which compels to make studies and works for reducing energy consumption. But we've also introduced some tools to facilitate the financing of renovations. For instance, third-party financing for poor households. We have now a framework which make low-rate loans to poor households, which are reimbursed by energy savings. Regarding transportation, we are focused on support to clean mobility, to reinforce support to electromobility, thanks to the bonus-malus system with tax on the vehicles which consume and emit a lot, and support to purchase of low-emitting vehicles. And also there is a public plan to implement charging points for electric vehicles. The minister also introduced incentives to use the bicycle to go from and to work. As a conclusion for building and transportation and energy efficiency, I would also add that we use energy saving certificates for energy efficiency. That is, people who sell energy are compelled to contribute to additional energy savings programs and measures. We've published last week the target of the commitment for the period 2018 to 2020, which is plus 80% in comparison to previous period. We have also other measures. I would like to quote that the waste and consumption sector is also levied to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we control planned obsolescence. We also decided to develop further the recycling through the producer's responsibility principle. And also there are now new compulsory obligations for sorting and valorization. For instance, for bio-waste, the municipalities will have to valorize bio-waste, all bio-waste in the year 2025. And to finish with the law, I would say that a big perspective focus was put on territories. First, new tools were given to territories, access to data consumption and data of consumption and production of energy, new facilities, legal facilities to invest more easily in renewables or energy financing, energy efficiency projects, a development of planning at local level, both at regional level, 13 regional level, for instance, in French metropolitan, and at the municipalities level. And but also, it's not only new obligations, new tools. It's also been launched by our Minister, Mrs. Royal, the program, a call for tenders for what we have called green growth projects in positive energy territories. More than 500 territories at municipalities level, or many municipalities gathered, have launched projects for renewable energy, clean mobility, energy renovation, circular economy, and the state gave them more than 600 million euros of support for these new programs. Just nearing the end, with just with this chart to say that as we made the national low carbon strategy and the multi-year energy planning, we've made economical assessment, and we've seen that it will have a positive GDP impact and also positive impact of employment between 100,000 to 350,000 jobs created. You'll see on the chart what are the impacts. The impact on import and export, it's green. Impact on consumption, impact on investment. Here it's the impact of GDP, but we have the same assessments through several models made also for employment. And of course, we will remake the assessments when we'll review the strategy, also to see that the measures are efficient both for greenhouse gas emissions, but for globally for economy. And just to finish, you've seen of this chart the past emission until 2015. We are in 2015. We are at -16%. Globally, and -20% for effort sharing decision emissions. So we are under our target for effort sharing decision, but we have to go further. We have now to think for 2020, but also 2030. You are in the report, biennial report 2, it's orange. You had what was the existing measures at the end of 2014. And now with the updated existing measures, the green line, our projected emissions, we are at -28% below 1990. This is, let's say, improving. It's good. It's better than the orange line, but it's not enough yet. If we want to have a 40% target of reduction of emissions compared to 1990. So we have to increase, to review our ambition and measures. That's why we are, as I said a few minutes ago, in the process of reviewing our national low carbon strategy this year and next year. And as a conclusion, I would like to reiterate our long-term commitment for long-term decarbonization. European Union and France are committed. We are online with this long-term path. We think it's a great opportunity for planet, economy, and environment. But we have to go on with innovation, to creativity, to go on together with all countries and also with subnational level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I now open the floor for the questions. I see China, then Iran, New Zealand, Canada. Australia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. Okay, China, please.
Thanks for the comprehensive presentation by France. We see that according to the ERT, the conclusion is that France may achieve or overachieve its emission reduction target by 2020. So I think there is a great potential space for them to enhance the ambition. And it's also appreciate to see that the national low carbon strategy with carbon budgets of France. So our question is, because we see the answers on the UNFCCC website, is that for the long-term strategy, especially for the 2050, the target, France said that they have the sectoral targets of the emission reduction on the transport sector for 70%. So now our question is, how could you please provide more information on the policy and measures on the transport sector to achieve this target? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Iran, please.
Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed the very informative presentation from France. I have noted that you're following a path to decouple population and GDP growth from emission rates. This is a real challenge, and I was wondering if you may be elaborating a bit on what you have contemplated so far in line, because it is a real challenge in a number of countries to be able to successfully put the additional burden on the reduction of the energy intensity as well as the carbon intensity in order to offset the effect of population and GDP growth. Offsetting is rather different to decoupling them. And this is something that I would be requesting your further elaboration on, so that it could base a better understanding and potentially duplicated by a number of other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. New Zealand, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, France, for your presentation. We note that in the presentation you mentioned your overseas territories. And so I was curious to know if you could please provide us with some further information on the institutional arrangements that you have in place to collect and include greenhouse gas emissions information from your overseas territories in your reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take Canada in this part.
Thank you very much, France, for your presentation. I was wondering if you could please elaborate on how your country engages with subnational authorities and with non-state actors in the implementation of your mitigation efforts. Are there any key factors of success or lessons learned through this engagement that we could benefit from? Thank you.
Thank you very much. France, please answer the questions.
Thank you for these questions. The question of China, as I understood well, was how do we think about transportation and sector and reduction on the long term? So I think for France, as I think for many countries, transportation is a big challenge since transportation now is mainly driven by use of fossil fuels. So in our national low carbon strategy, the sector in which until 2028 or around, let's say, 2030, we aim at a reduction around 30%, and this is a first big and difficult step. In the short medium term, we think we have to act on several tools. We have to act on the demand of transportation or the efficiency of transportation. For instance, how to have more people in cars. We have only 1.7 people in cars in France on average. And our first short-term target is to go at 2.1%. So we have to encourage car sharing and so on. Of course, we have to work on public transportation, go on with the efforts. So transport demand and efficiency, and also to promote movement from from truck transport to railroad or ships. But this is quite difficult. Second part is to have more efficient vehicles. That's why under European regulation, we have a regulation on CO2 emissions of cars, but we add above that specific incentives to discourage purchase of strong emitting cars and to encourage purchase of electric vehicles. And also, European Union will start with a regulation on trucks, CO2 emission of trucks. And we have just this year started a little later about, regarding to other countries, a program to support natural gas for trucks, which emits less than diesel trucks. We have also a plan to incorporate more biofuels and sustainable ones, of course, in transportations. And that's why, for instance, in our law, the targets of renewables for 2030 is 15%. We are now at around 6.5 renewable in transportation energy consumption. Targets of 2030 is to go to 15%. So this is the first step. If we go to a longer term perspective, which is still more difficult, we have to add on all these levies and probably really to focus on development on very clean vehicles, electric, hydrogen ones, and advanced biofuels. But this is really a big challenge. If I go on, I think Aaron, the question was decoupling of population growth, economic growth, and on which sectors do we have to concentrate, if I understood well the question. First, I would say that we have to concentrate on all sectors because really we've seen, even if the biggest challenges are in building sector for France, biggest challenges are in building consumptions and transportation. For instance, as you know, our electricity production is already mainly decarbonized, so we don't have many gains there. So we have to concentrate on these two ones, but in all sectors also, because the two big sectors don't allow us to have to reach our targets. We have to concentrate on agriculture, less emissions, or more sequestrations of CO2 on waste and so on. So afterwards, for each sector, really, with our lessons, I say, our experience shows that we have to work both on the past, for instance, renovation of our stock of buildings, as we are, let's say, an old country with a huge building park. We have to renovate a big amount of our park was built without regulation for energy consumption. It was before the 70s. So this park of building has to be renovated. We have to focus on that. But we have also to work on the future. That's why, for instance, regarding building, we are now experimenting a new label, which will probably be transcribed into law for new buildings in 1 or 2 years' time, for buildings which are really zero carbon in their whole life cycle, including the gray energy and carbon consumed for the building process and deconstruction. And so that's why also we invest a lot in investment for innovation, for demonstration projects of new materials for building new vehicles. And that's really, I think, only with all this set of measures, compulsory ones, financial ones with carbon price and incentives, you can't only tax, you have to put incentive to help people, and innovation that we have to work. New Zealand, you asked the question of how we collect data for overseas territories. In fact, we have a national statistics system, but does not sometimes include with same precision the overseas territories. That's why for each territories, our big islands, let's say, or even the small ones, we have a specific approach for each territory, for the inventory and also the projections. And we collect specific data for each territory regarding the fuel consumptions for transportation or for electricity production. And so really we make an approach for each overseas territory. I have to add that as we make for metropolitan France what we have presented, the multi-year energy programmation, we make also this program, which is reviewed every 5 years for each overseas territory. They make this program between the state and the region. So this allows us to make more precise inventories and projections for the islands. And this makes the transitions with Canadian questions with subnational authorities. There's been, let's say, a big change in the 10 last years in an energy system which was mainly centralized with big transmission distribution networks, big national regulations, and let's say small place for local authorities initiative. It has changed drastically due to emergence of renewables, and also due to the fact that we've shared with subnational authorities that we have to act with all actors, because if we want to renovate buildings, we can say in Paris, renovate the buildings, but people who renovate the buildings, they are the subnational authorities helped with local banks and so on. They can be in touch with the population. So there's been successive new powers given to the subnational authorities, powers and duties, for instance, to make regional plans, which have been made between the national state and the region, and which in the coming years will be made with the regions in autonomy. And also they are called regional schemes for climate, air and energy. And also at municipalities or gathering of municipalities level, the municipalities above 20,000 inhabitants have to make, and so have already made, and now everybody will have made what we call a local air, energy and climate plan defining targets and actions. The idea is to define at local level targets. And the idea also is to have, by the way, support from the state, financial support and also methodological support. We've held what we call a local platform for renovations, which are information and advice desks for citizens who want to renovate the house. We have the target of more than 450 renovation platforms. As I quoted in the presentation, our Minister, Mr. Royal, launched the call for tenders for territories with more than 500 territories which was helped. We've also introduced what we called the Fund for Renewable Heat, which gives subsidies to industries and mainly to local authorities to build heating networks which are fed by renewable sources, mainly biomass, but also now a strong development of geothermy. So let's say new responsibilities, financial support, and also new legal data for starting this year. Now all the municipalities and regions have the right to access to the data of distribution and transmission networks of electricity, gas and heat in their territorial resort, and at a very precise detailed level, which allows them to have an adapted policy. So you asked the question, what were the key factors of success? It's perhaps a little early to decide and to be definitive on that, but we can see that, and we've seen that in many countries it's been like that. The political will of mayors, of presidents of regions, but also of citizens, of local trade unions, local unions of industries is very strong. So we have to rely and to help these initiatives and also to try to make a kind of return of experience, to share experiences between regional and local authorities. And we make that with the help of ADEME, which is an agency for environment and energy saving, which is a state agency, but which works with local authorities in all the regions. So I will stop here for the first round.
Okay, thank you very much. This is half of the first round. So the first round continues with Australia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and India. Australia, you've got the floor, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Franz, for your presentation. We just noticed in your projections that the LULUCF sector becomes a significant sink in the years between 2020 and 2030. And we were just wondering if you could talk about what policies and measures have been put in place or are going to be put in place to enable that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Saudi Arabia, please.
Thank you, Michel and Franz, for a very comprehensive presentation. As we saw on your presentation, that France focusing mainly on energy sector, in particular the transportation. Does France report their assessment of economic and social consequences of the response measures in their PRs and the national communication, or they are looking to elaborate and provide more information on this assessment in their next PR? Thank you.
Thank you. Brazil, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, France, for providing the presentation. I would like to refer to an answer provided during the written phase, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank France for providing very clear answers during the written phase, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank Canada as well for providing very clear answers during the written phase. I apologize for not doing that during the questions to Canada. But, and I would like to link the written answer by France to the presentation today. During the written phase, France stated that the main reason for the variation in CO2 emissions between BR1 and BR2 comes from different assumptions on the electric power mix. And France stated also that the emissions of energy industries are very low due to the important share of nuclear energy. And France states also that this difference between BR1 and BR2 illustrates the sensitivity of results in the energy sector. I think it could be useful for parties as lessons learned, because it's common to have the sense that the LUCF has very fluctuations regarding projections and numbers, and France is indicating that this problem happens to the energy sector as well. It's very important. But coming back to nuclear energy, during the presentation, France presented that there is a target to reduce the share of nuclear power to 50% by 2025. And I would like to ask if France could please provide what is the current share of nuclear energy, and if France is referring to energy mix or electricity mix, just to clarify that. Regarding the projections on new policies and measures, I would like to follow up on the Australian question and ask France if it's possible to consider the new policies and measures more broader than the LUCF sector, because France stated that the effect of new policies and measures since BR2 is very huge. There is a very big difference between the projections in BR2 and the updated projections coming from the new policies and measures. And I would like to kindly ask you to elaborate on the policies and measures to bring these very impressive results regarding the projections in BR2 and the projections considering new policies and measures since BR2. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And India closes the list.
Thank you, Chair. Very good presentation by France. Please accept our commendations. France has provided a very detailed account of funding provided region-wise, sector-wise, and so on. So in this context, we are tempted to ask if you could elaborate upon funding to be provided or to be provided for NDC implementation in future in developing countries. The other small question is, you see, France derives mainly 75% of its electricity from one source. Does France intend to increase the share of other sources in future? And if yes, has the impact of a reduction in the use of one type of fuel been analyzed in the context of GHG emissions? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So another set of interesting questions to France. You've got the floor, Laurent.
So there were questions from Australia and sort of a little of Brazil on LULUCF because this increase of the sink and policies and measures. Perhaps if needed, our specialist will complete. We have reported an increase of the sink from between 2020 and 2030. This increase is mainly due to an increased sink in forest lands. The balance of other lands are projected to remain relatively stable, and it remains consistent with our updated with existing measure scenario, which we have produced this year. Perhaps the increase in 2030 will be a little less than we have forecasted, but it seems in the same amount. It stays coherent. We have first to know that we had known in French metropolitan forest a significant dynamic of capitalization since several decades. It is a structural phenomenon linked with forest transition and policies which started in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. There was a rural exodus and a natural reforestation. And afterwards, there have been planned reforestation during the second half of the 20th century, and they have contributed to the phenomenon of the dynamic of forest land sink. And in our scenarios, we assume that we continue the practices of forest management, and the level of harvest is supposed to stay constant around 50% of the natural increment. So if the harvest is lower than the natural increment, it implies an increase of the sink. But besides these structural explanations coming rather from the past and the continuity, policies and measures have been designed to go on this mitigation potential to improve it. And there are some fiscal insurance and institutional instruments which have been introduced. For instance, there are fiscal instruments such as fiscal measures to encourage development in forestry, which gives incentives to forest owners to adopt and implement practices of sustainable management of forest. Also, there is a forest and interest investment accounts which help forest owners to take out interest against storm risks by improving the resilience of their forest stands. And there was also a law for future of agriculture, food and forestry, which has been adopted in 2014 to modernize agricultural and forest sectors by promoting both economical and environmental performance. And there has, for instance, been a new institutional tool, the Forest and Economical and Environmental Investment Groups, that facilitates the clustering of forest owners at the scale of forest massives. And that we have small-scale forest owners, so we encourage them to work together in these clusters, which allows them to have to make more easily investments, replantations, and so on. The Ministry of Agriculture has also introduced a strategic fund for forestry and wood industries to work on the long term. For other land of categories, the variations are smaller than for forest, but some policies are worth to be mentioned. We have some ambitious projects of agroecology and agroforestry with several measures, for instance, work on surfaces and rotation and cover crops, so that the question of soil is treated. We also have introduced a policy to reduce dependence on inputs, improve soil fertility, and development of synergies between livestock, cultures, management of organic waste. We encourage return to soil of organic waste, and also the development of leguminous crop farming. And also, just to recall that at international level, we are part of launch the 4 per 1,000 initiative to promote the importance of the soil for climate action. And so that were a few words on LULUCF. If needed, could have some words. Il y a des choses à ajouter sur LULUCF? LULUCF, vous voulez ajouter quelque chose? No, it's okay. It's okay. Expert says it's okay. Question, so I think from Saudi Arabia, questions of assessment of impacts, and also question of capacity building and response measures. So for more assessments for response measures in our next material report, we will also, of course, continue to assess every new policy and consider when needed in details, the question of response measures. But just would say that each year France implements a large number of technology transfer and capacity building projects in developing countries, helping to minimize the adverse effects of policy measures. And we will go on with this effort through, for instance, the AFD, French Agency for Development. We also want to help developing countries to improve their climate change observation systems for climate observation network, and also we are committed to research and cooperation projects. And also Europe also is involved in this both assessment project, impact assessment of the measures, and also of the dynamic for relationships with developing countries. Questions for Brazil were, as I understood well, first on nuclear question, the part of nuclear in the electricity or total mix. When we say to go to 50%, it's in the electricity mix. At the present stage, share of nuclear electricity was last year around, I believe, 72% of nuclear share, a little less than 20% of renewables, and 7-8% of fossil fuels, mainly gas for peak and winter periods. And so when we speak about a target of 50% around 2025, 2030, it's in the electricity mix. Your question was the reason for the gap between Biennial Report 1 and Biennial Report 2. Mainly, we introduced in Biennial Report 2 the new measures we knew and which have been decided, especially in also energy transition law. I presented the measures of the law and also the action plans, the call for tender for renewables, the renovation plan for housings, in which the target is to go to 500,000 renovations per year. 5 years ago, we were around 280,000 renovations of houses per year. Now we are more between around 350,000, and we have to go to 500. So it's all measures I presented, but I could not present all of them. Are the difference between Biennial Report 1 and 2. Question of India, which was one of finance. Mrs. Collier, Ambassador for Climate Change, Environment, could answer on our effort on that.
Thank you very much. The question of India was about our support to the implementation of NDCs in developing countries, if I'm correct. France decided to strongly increase its support to climate action, to raise it from 3 billion euros a year to 5 million euros a year by 2020. This effort, we do it through bilateral cooperation, and especially through the French Agency for Development, and also through another organ which is in French called FEM. AFD, for the French Agency for Development, for instance, just established a specific facility in 2016 to support countries in the implementation of their NDCs. The idea is to assist in the definition of a governance of sectoral policies, and to this effort, which targets the most vulnerable countries and the least developed countries, they have decided to allocate 30 million euros. An important part of our support also goes through the multilateral institutions, and especially the Green Climate Fund, our contribution to the GCF is $1 billion. And part of it is for the strengthening of, for capacity building and the implementation of NDCs. And of course, there is all participation to multilateral development institutions such as the World Bank.
Thank you very much. I think Brazil wants to clarify something.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, actually, my question was not about the comparison between BR1 and BR2, but Brazil would like to thank you for the clarification. Actually, we would like to hear from France regarding the difference between the results, the projections regarding the BR2 and the projections after BR2 considered new policies and measures. You presented in the end of your presentation. What kind of new policies and measures could result on this very difference between projections since BR2 and after BR2? And I'd just like to take advantage to highlight one very important point stated by France, which is the positive impact on creating new jobs. I think it shows to the parties that it's possible to have policies on climate change and at the same time generate new jobs. And I think it's a very good, important and positive message. Thank you.
Okay, Frank, would you like to make the response?
Yes, in fact, regarding the question, in fact, from BR1 to BR2 and from now to our projection, in fact, we've added at each time the new measures which became existing measures. In BR2, we had some measures which were already planned and which are in our law, and now in our projections, we have the measures which have been decided in the law in 2015 and which have came into force, measures for regulation for renovation of old buildings, compulsory measures or incentives, measures for transportation. So really, and as we make for both for report to European Union and to UNFCCC each 2 years these reports, we check all the new measures which come into force, and we put them into our projection. And what is interesting now is that we connect the projections we make for UNFCCC and European Union to our national process of the review of the national low carbon strategy, which we start this year. So really, we assess with an expert committee or with energy experts, economical experts, but also with the stakeholders, with subnational authorities, with trade unions, with industry unions, and so on, with also agricultural sector. In these projections, we assess the impact, the costs, the benefits, with the greenhouse gas reduction, the energy reduction. We assess that in our projections for both report to UNFCCC and national policy definition. And as I said, we have just started some weeks ago to reassess all that, to make new projections, to go to the -40 in 2030, because as you said in the chart, we are only at -28%.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for excellent presentation, very interesting questions. And we are now moving to Greece. So I'd like to invite, on behalf of Greece, Mr. Kyriakos Psychas, Head of Climate Change Department of the Ministry of Environment and Energy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning to all delegations. So, please. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So Greece is located in southeastern Europe on the southern end of the Balkan Peninsula, and has a total area of approximately 132,000 square kilometers, consisting of two main geographic areas: a peninsular mainland and around 6,000 islands scattered in the Aegean and Ionian Sea. The country has very rich biodiversity. Approximately 20% of its area is under natural protected biotop sites. Some more basic data: the population of Greece is around 10.8 million people. Gross domestic product of Greece is 175.7 billion euros, or around 16,000 euro per capita in prices of 2015. The GDP has decreased by 26.4% in 2015 compared to 2007 due to the infamous economic recession. Now, for whatever regards the greenhouse gases emission profile, in 2015, greenhouse gases emissions without LULUCF amounted to 95.7 million tons CO2 equivalent, showing a decrease of 7.15% compared to 1990 levels, and minus 29% compared to 2007 levels. If emission removals from LULUCF were to be included, then the decrease would be even more, would be 8.25% in 2015 compared again to 1990 levels. You can say that the decreasing trend of emissions of the years 2008 to 2015, which is attributed to the effect of mitigation actions, but as well to the economic recession. Concerning the greenhouse gas emission mitigation commitments of Greece, the 2020 target under the Convention for the EU and its member states is an unconditional quantified economy-wide emission reduction target of 20% by 2020 compared to 1990 levels. Moreover, Greece has a binding commitment under Kyoto Protocol for the second commitment period, which is 2013 to 2020, which is a joint commitment of the EU, its member states, and Iceland to reduce average annual emissions during 2013-2020 by 20% compared to base year. Finally, the internal targets across member states are defined by the Climate and Energy Package, which is a set of binding legislation which aims to ensure that the European Union meets its ambitious climate and energy targets for 2020. Under the Kyoto Protocol, the EU and its member states in Doha adopted a quantified emission limitation or reduction commitment of 20% reduction from base year for the period 23-2020. For the second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol concerning LULUCF activities, the activities under Articles 3.3 are afforestation, reforestation, and deforestation, and 3.4 forest management will be accounted by Greece. Sorry, we have mixed the thing. Okay. Okay, so. Okay, so it's the project. Sorry, I have mixed the thing here. Focusing on the Greek targets related to the climate and energy package, we have for 18% for renewables, an EU-wide target, which is mandatory until 2020. This was increased nationally to 20%. The national target of Greece to contribute 20% energy savings till 2020 is to limit final energy consumption below 18.4 million tons oil equivalent in 2020. And for non-ETS sectors or effort-sharing decision between EU countries, a 4% reduction of 2020 emissions compared to 2005 levels. And the ETS sectors know that there is a single EU-wide cap applied for that. Under the Kyoto Protocol, the EU and its member states in Doha adopted a quantified emission limitation or reduction commitment of 20% reduction from base year for the period 2013-2020. And for the second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol concerning LULUCF activities, under Articles 3.3 and 3.4 will be accounted by Greece. The total emissions of Greece in 2020 are projected to be 9.5% below the levels of 1990 emissions, or 31.5% lower than 2005 levels. The emissions from ETS sectors in 2020 are projected to be 36.2% lower than 2005. and the non-ETS sectors in 2020 are projected to be 26.4% lower than 2005. Now, concerning the 2020 non-ETS targets, or the ESD target of Greece pursuant to European legislation, by comparing the annual emission allocation for the years 2013-2020 with the historic emissions for years 2013-2015, and the projected emissions for the rest of the years from ESD sectors, it is projected that Greece will actually overachieve the non-ETS 2020 target on the basis of the domestic policies and measures without the use of market-based mechanisms. Some climate-related data. A total mitigation effect of implemented and adopted policies is estimated to be around 22.4 million tons CO2 equivalent in 2015. It is projected to be 30 million tons CO2 equivalent in 2020. The key climate indicators presented in this slide show a decreasing trend, which proves that the mitigation policies are delivering results. For example, the total CO2 intensity of GDP was reduced by 25% in 2015 since 2000. Total CO2 intensity per capita was reduced by 33.5% compared to 2005. The energy-related CO2 intensity of GDP was reduced by 17.5% compared to 2000. The carbon intensity of total power generation was reduced by 41.2% compared to 1990. The energy-related CO2 intensity of industry was reduced by 30% compared to 2000, and the specific CO2 intensity of households was reduced by 42.4% compared to 2000. And now coming to the 2030 Climate Energy Framework and Paris Agreement, Greece ratified the Paris Agreement on the 7th of October 2016. And concerning our NDC, which was communicated under the Paris Agreement, the EU and its member states are committed to a binding target of at least 40% domestic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 1990. And this will enable the EU to take cost-effective steps towards its long-term objective of cutting emissions by 80 to 95% by 2050 in the context of necessary reductions by developed countries as a group, and make a fair and ambitious contribution to the new international climate agreement. Now, I concluded the basic presentation, and I will pass the floor to Mr. Ioannis Sembus, which is from the National Technical University of Athens, that provide scientific support to the Ministry of the Environment and Energy to proceed with the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you. The next slides contain an overview of the questions received and answered provided during the 3-month question and answer period. We have received in total 3 questions. The first was about why we include under the with existing measures scenario only implemented and adopted policies and measures up to the year 2008 and not including more recent pumps. We replied that each of the policies and measures that reported in PR referred to a group of policies and measures that consist of a number of mitigation actions that have the same scope or objective, cover the same sector, subsector, and in general are of the same type. Some of these actions started up to year 2008 and haven't been changed since then. Some other have been trimmed or adjusted when necessary in order to conform to the current national circumstances. Some other have been supplemented with additional elements in cases where the expected benefits are lagging behind planned outcomes or other national circumstances. As an example, I will refer in these slides to the mitigation policy entitled Improvements in the Conventional Power Generation System. The main mitigation actions included under this group of action is the gradual decommissioning of old, inefficient, and more pollutant thermal power units, the commissioning of new power units that follows best available techniques and the new EU Industrial Emission Directive, the increase of natural gas share in electricity production, the connection of certain islands with the mainland grid,
and the decommissioning of a number of lignite-fired and heavy fuel oil-fired power units till 2025. These units will be substituted by NG-fired plants and renewable energy sources. Each of these actions is ongoing and started either in 1996 or after 1996. We selected the year 1996 as the start year of implementation in the BR report because the introduction of natural gas in the national energy system, which is one of the largest investments ever carried out in Greece, was done in 1996 when an important part of the infrastructure, mainly the high-pressure transmission system and the medium-pressure network, which is necessary for the transport of natural gas to the main region of consumption, has been completed. However, many elements of this policy started a lot later of 1996 or haven't started yet. For example, the interconnection of islands to the mainland grid is being implemented according to the following phases. The interconnection of Kyklades Islands is expected to be ready in 2018, and the interconnection of Creta is planned for 2025. The next question was related with with additional measure scenario, asking why Greece did not report it Table 6C entitled Information on updated greenhouse gas projections under with additional measure scenario. Our reply is based on the fact that the reporting of this scenario is not a salary requirement according to the reporting guideline. As it was shown in the previous slides, our national target, the ESD target, is going to be met by the with measure scenario with high certainty. Therefore, it was decided that there is no value of reporting with additional measure scenario. In the third and last question we were asked to provide current estimates of the mitigation impact since the respective years of implementation of the mitigation actions reported in the BR2. Answering to this question, we explain that the mitigation effect has been estimated by comparing the actual data, for example, data for the 2015 National Energy Balance, with a hypothetical without measure scenario that does not include the mitigation effect of the examined policy or measure. The total mitigation effect of the PAMs reported in BR is 22.4 million tons CO2 equivalent for year 2015. A detailed table with the individual effect of each mitigation policy was provided during the question and answer phase. In the next slides, the individual mitigation effect of each policy is presented as it was communicated. For example, for the improvements in the conventional power generation system, around 7.4 million tons CO2 were avoided. And for the increase of renewable energy sources in electricity generation, around 11.4 million tons were also avoided. From measures in the agriculture sector, for example, the improvement of management of animal waste, increase of organic farming, and decrease of the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, around 800 kilotons of CO2 equivalent were mitigated. Thank you very much, and some nice photos from Greece.
Well, Greece always looks very well on the photos. Thank you very much, colleagues. I can see a flag from colleague. I'm not sure. It's Korea, I suppose. Korea, then Brazil, then New Zealand and India. So Korea, you've got the floor, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Greece, for comprehensive presentation. Greece shows dramatic decrease in GHG emission and appreciate your effort. I have one quick question, actually. Can Greece distinguish the GHG reduction between economic recession and the mitigation policy and measures? That's it.
Thank you very much. The next is Brazil.
Hello, good afternoon. First, I wish to thank the Greek delegation for answering the Brazilian questions in a very clear and thorough way. My question now is about the paragraph 42 of the report of the technical review in terms of the recommendation to improve the transparency of its reporting by elaborating on the rationale for the changes of the reported impacts of the policies and measures that had changes made since the previous BR submission, and by clarifying any changes in the names and starting years of implementation in its next BR submission. So we wish to know how we're going to proceed with the recommendations proposed by the technical review. Thank you.
Thank you. New Zealand, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Greece, for the presentation. And I guess building on the question just asked by Brazil, we note that in your biennial report, you provided quantified estimates of mitigation impacts for the majority of your policies and measures, and we commend you for doing so. So I was wondering if you could please provide a bit more information on what types of methodologies you use to estimate these projected impacts. Thank you.
Thank you. And India, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the distinguished delegate from Greece for very nice presentation. We have just two small questions. The first one is that Greece is to increase its emissions from 2013 to 20 based on the EU 2020 pledge. How would you ensure environmental integrity in the process? The second small question is, what has been more successful in bringing down emissions in Greece in the past? The EU ETS sectors or the ESD sector policies? Also, please mention if it was the result of an economic slowdown. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, Greece, you've got the floor.
Thank you for the questions. We will start with to reply to the question received from Korea. As you have seen in the slide entitled Key Climate-Related Data, our emissions have been our ratios that reflect the emissions compared to GDP populations have a decreasing trend. This denotes that the policies and measures has an effect. Indeed, our emissions have been reduced due to the economic recession that has hit our country the last year, since 2007-2008. However, as we have presented in the slide about the key climate-related data, in 2015, the estimated mitigation effect of the implemented and adopted policies is around 22.4 million tons CO2 equivalent. More CO2 will be mitigated during the next year, since, for example, renewable energy sources will going to increase their share in the national energy mixture, as we saw in another slide. It is projected that the total mitigation effect of policies and measures in 2020 will be around 30 million tons CO2 equivalent. So, moving to the question from New Zealand about the quantification of the mitigation impact of policies and measures. The mitigation effect is estimated by comparing the with measure scenario with a hypothetical baseline scenario that does not include the mitigation effect of the examined policy or measure. I will give you some examples. For example, the mitigation effect of renewable energy sources technologies for electricity production is estimated by multiplying the electricity produced by renewable energy sources by the average emission factor of all thermal plants of the electricity generation system. This emission factor varies annually depending on the energy mix of each year. The mitigation effect of year T is estimated based on the emission factor of this year, which is calculated according to the fossil fuel energy mixture of the same year. By this way, we separate the effect of this policy from the mitigation effect of other policies and measures, which, for example, is related to the increase of the efficiency of power plants and the use of natural gas. So there is no double counting of the mitigation effect. We avoid this double counting. Another example for the sector of the consumption of fluorinated gases, the mitigation of emissions of these gases, how we calculate this effect. We based on the models we use for our greenhouse gas inventory, and we create two scenarios. One which reflects the provisions of the new EU F-gases regulation, 517 of 2014, and one without reflecting this regulation. For example, without reflecting the ban in the use of some F-gases with high GWP, which is mentioned in this regulation. The difference between the two scenarios is the mitigation effect. If you need any further clarification, please do not hesitate to send us a written question about the quantification of the mitigation effect, either through the MA portal or with another way. Just a moment. Going to the question received from Brazil, of course, we are going to implement the recommendation of the ERT that reviewed our BR2. But we would like to make a comment that the information that was reported in BR2 is more accurate and is based on more recent data compared to BR1. And in every reporting cycle, we are trying to improve our reporting submission by submission. The change of names has made in order to better reflect the mitigation actions that are included in each group of policies and measures. Okay. And just a moment. Going to the question received by India, the policies with the highest impact, or let's say the most successful policies, were the policies that were related to ETS sectors. The current and projected emission reductions and the resulting potential overachievement are largely the result of structural policies implemented in the field of climate and energy. In particular, policies resulting in improvements in energy intensity of the economy, decommission of old inefficient thermal power units, which is under ETS, increase of NG, natural gas share in energy mixture, and higher share of renewables, which is also under the ETS sector. Such policies have contributed to the majority of the emission reductions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more request to ask the question from China. Got the floor.
Thanks for the presentation by Greece. We are happy to see that Greece binding the national target for renewable energy, which collectively will lift the average renewable share across the EU to 20% by 2020. So could you please elaborate more of your experience on the development of renewable energy that we could benefit from? Thank you.
Greece.
Well, to answer China, thank you for your question. And whether Greece is on track to meet the 2020 renewable energy target. The penetration of renewables in the gross final energy consumption increased 14% in 2014 compared with 2012, surpassing the respective projected penetration of the National Renewable Energy Action Plan. In the second progress report, the main parameter shifting the overall share of renewables in the gross final energy consumption higher than expected was the use of renewables for heating purposes in the final energy consumption, and specific residential sector. Specifically, in the last 5 years, we had a significant increase in the use of biomass that has been observed due to the final consumer shift to biomass as a cheaper fuel to meet our heating needs and the consequences of the economic recession in the household income. Well, nevertheless, the consumed quantities of biomass in households decreased by 9% in 2014 compared with the corresponding 2012 levels. Apart from that, we have the solar thermal systems that steadily have attained an important position in renewable applications for domestic hot water production. Almost all buildings in Greece, they have a solar thermal system. And then the penetration of heat pumps for space heating has exhibited a significant growth rate in the last 2 years, leading to an increase of 65% in 2014 compared with 2012. The penetration of renewables for heating already stands at 26.9% in 2014, surpassing even the corresponding indicative target for 2020. And the utilization of renewables for heating purposes increased 15% in 2014 compared with 2012. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Greece. We are now moving to Iceland, to northern end of Europe. And I invite Ms. Helga Barthadottir, the head of division, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Iceland. You got the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. And we are happy to participate in this process here. Iceland received 15 questions electronically during the question and answering process on actually various issues. And we have provided written answers, and I will not go through the questions in detail in here, but I would rather like to give you an overview of our emission profile, targets, and policies. And just to set the scene a bit, Iceland is a small country with small population, or about 340,000 people, which is actually little more than the population of Bonn. Our population density is only 3.3% per square kilometers. Our economy relies largely on natural resources, fisheries, and renewable energy, with the main exports being seafood and products from the power-intensive industry, mainly aluminium. In recent years, tourism has been the fastest growing industry in Iceland and has established itself as the third main pillar of our economy. Population growth in Iceland is a bit higher than in most European countries, and economic growth has returned after difficult years in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008. Iceland touches the Arctic Circle, but the climate is relatively mild thanks to the Gulf Stream. So we must hope that that doesn't change. This is the legal framework, which is illustrated there, and our international climate commitments. We are party to the Kyoto Protocol, and we have fulfilled our targets for the first commitment period. For the current commitment period, Iceland is part of a joint fulfillment of 29 countries of a common target. These are the 28 member states of the EU and Iceland. We sought this arrangement as Iceland is a member of the European Economic Area, and as such already has some 40% of its emissions in the EU emission trading scheme, which the European countries have been telling us about here today. Iceland thought it to be sensible to ensure that climate rules were similar under a global commitment and under the rules of the European Economic Area. Iceland signed an agreement with the EU on its share of the joint fulfillment in 2015. With the arrangement, Iceland is subject to comparable rules and targets as member states of the EU. On one hand, some 40% of the emissions are in the EU ETS system, where companies get allocated emissions units, and on the other hand, are non-ETS emissions, where states get targets and units based on certain criteria. With this arrangement, it can be said that Iceland's climate mitigation regime is largely comparable to that of EU member states. And this is our emission and how it divides by the sectors. Industrial processes are the largest sources of greenhouse gas emission in Iceland, followed by energy, agriculture, and waste. Overall emission are though small, 4,600 kilotons, and to put it into perspective, Iceland's emission is about 0.01% of global emission and about 0.1% of the emission of the European Union. Although our emission is small in a global perspective, the per capita emission is rather high, or 14 tons per capita. Our electricity production is almost 100% renewable, and the same can be said about house heating. Although all stationary energy comes from renewables, energy is still a big part of our emission profile, but mainly from transport and the fishing industry. I would like to point out that Iceland has ample opportunities for afforestation and revegetation to reverse past soil erosions and seize carbon uptake by such activities as providing mitigation opportunities that in some way compensates for Iceland's almost absent opportunities to reduce emissions from energy production.
Excuse me, can you try to use your remote, because I think that the slides do not move.
Oh, sorry. Nei, þetta var... And as I said earlier, all our electricity production comes from renewables, but although energy is a big part of our emission profile. So I just wanted to break down, show you the energy emission profile by sources. We have hydro and geothermal for electricity production and geothermal water to heat our buildings. So emission from stationary energy production is very, very small. The biggest factor is the transport sector, followed by the fishing industry. Therefore, as I said before, there are insignificant mitigation potential in the energy sector, where the lowest hanging fruits are for many other countries. I also want to tell you that electricity production in Iceland, renewable electricity production in Iceland, has increased from 4.5 terawatt hours in 1990 to 18.7 terawatt hours in 2015. And about 75% of our production, electricity production, is used by the power-intensive industry. And this is our emission trends. Our total emission has increased since 1990, about 28%, and it will be actually a challenge to meet our 2020 targets. It should be noted that the bulk of the increase in emissions, both in recent years and in projections, is from heavy industry that is regulated within the EU ETS and needs to buy emissions permits within that system. These emissions that's firmly regulated and accounted for under the regional climate regulation in the European Economic Area. And the joint fulfillment arrangement Iceland has with the European Union and its member states under the Kyoto Protocol in 2013 to 2020. The share of emission from industrial processes increased by 27% from 1990 to 44% in 2015. Emissions from road vehicles have increased since 1990 owing to increased in population, numbers of car per capita, more mileage driven, and until 2007, when we had our recession, an increase in the share of large vehicles. Since 1990, the vehicle fleet in Iceland has increased by 78%. At the same time, the emissions from fishing have decreased by 38%. The share of emissions from energy sector decreased from 50% in 1990 to 38% in 2015, caused mainly by emission reductions in the fisheries sector, as old ships have been replaced by new and more energy efficient ships. Agriculture and the waste sector accounted for 14% and 5% respectively of 2015 emission. On mitigations. In 2010, a mitigation action plan intended to help Iceland meet its Kyoto Protocol commitments was launched with 10 key actions. On the base of the action plan, a carbon tax was implemented on fuel. The tax is levied on fossil fuels in liquid and gaseous form with respect to the carbon content of the fuel. And since 2011, electrical cars and low-emission cars have been exempted from excise duties. Focus was also put on supporting public transport and cycling, especially by municipalities. In 2015, the government launched the Special Climate Action Plan to supplement the Climate Mitigation Action Plan from 2010. The special plan was intended inter alia to strengthen mitigation actions, such as financing charging stations for electrical cars and designing roadmaps for reducing emissions in agriculture and fisheries. Increased funds were put to afforestation, revegetation, and wetland restoration. Currently, a committee is reviewing the tax system regarding fuel and vehicles and should deliver proposals early this summer on further steps to encourage the use of low-emitting vehicles. We saw an upward trend on sales in plug-in hybrid cars in 2016 and expect the trend to continue, as well as sales of pure electric cars. There is also a clear sign of increase in bicycling in Reykjavik municipality area, with improving infrastructure for cyclists, and the use of public transport has also increased. In 2016, the percentage of renewable in the transport sector was 6%, and in accordance to a parliamentary resolution, which is now discussed in the parliament, the proposed target for renewables in transport sector is 40% 2030. At last, I would like to mention a project that deals with capturing of CO2, where the gas is injected into the basaltic rock where the CO2 mineralizes. This process, which is estimated to take centuries in nature, seems to take less than 2 years with this method. This is a very promising open source method which has been initiated by scientists and industry together. And what is happening now? Actually, last week, the government launched a work on new climate action plan, which should help Iceland to meet its Paris Agreement goals and reduce GHG emissions from all sectors up to 2030. The work is co-led by the Prime Minister and the Minister for the Environment and Natural Resources, with involvement of 4 other ministers responsible for finance, transport, fisheries and agriculture, and industry, energy and tourism. The focus is on involvement of all the relevant actors from different sectors, both public as well as private. The action plan is due by the end of this year, and the main focus will be on the transport sector, fisheries, agriculture, and agriculture. And our challenges. The biggest challenge we are facing with emissions right now is a result of a sharp economic upturn fueled by the unprecedented growth in tourism. As you can see on this graph, since the year 2000, the numbers of tourists has grown from 300,000 to 1.8 million in 2016. And bear in mind that the population of Iceland is only 340,000 people. Increased transport and construction due to this tourism boom is a challenge for Iceland's infrastructure and emissions control. I would also like to mention under the heading challenges that we think we need to improve emissions projections. We hope to be able to start working on detailed projections for all sectors later this year to be published in our biannual report in December. In general, Iceland sees it as a formidable challenge to meet ambitious mitigation goals, given the fact that almost all stationary energy comes from renewables. We also foresee that accounting rules which only allow us to count our efforts in afforestation and revegetation partly against our emissions. But Iceland will strive to meet its targets, and our government is fully committed to the task. And I want to conclude by showing you these three photos. They're relatively easy access to our glaciers, and we can clearly see the dramatic changes that are happening right in front of our eyes. And we can see that our glaciers are shrinking very fast. These photos are taken from the same spot towards the Sólheimajökull Glacier in South Iceland. The first one is taken in 1997 and the last one in 2010, where there is no sign of the glacier. So this is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I see Korea. Korea and China, Canada. Korea, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the comprehensive presentation. I think, as you mentioned, tourism is one of the most important industries in your country. And what is the role of tourism in GHG emission? And I guess that it is quite difficult to apply GHG mitigation policies on tourism. So what policy has Iceland applied to reduce the GHG emission caused by tourism? That's my question. Thank you.
Now, China, please.
Thanks for the presentation by Iceland. We have a question about what we found in the technical review report, because we find that the industrial process and transport sector, these two are the two key drivers to the emission increase. So could you please introduce more of your additional measures towards these two drivers and to help to achieve the 2020 target? Thank you.
Thank you, and Canada.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Iceland, for your very informative presentation. We would like to ask if you'd be able to elaborate a little bit more on your success in implementing measures to improve public transportation and cycling, and how that's reduced your emissions. Thank you very much.
Okay, over to you, Iceland.
Thank you. Thank you, Cora. Regarding emission from tourism, as I said in my last slide, it is difficult to track emission from tourism as such. But the main impact of tourism in our greenhouse gas emission is from the transport sector, and our main effort is on the transport sector to reduce emission from the sector, and with measure that make people to buy. We have incentives for electrical cars, and we want to. We have carbon tax on fuel. So these are our main measures. But and as I also said in my presentation, that our projections have not been all that good until now, but we hope to be able to make them better and hopefully be able to publish them in our biannual report our next annual report. The question from China was also China asked about our emission from industry and transport. And as I have elaborated on the transport sector, we are taking measures there. And regarding the industrial processes, they are regulated under the ETS system. So we don't take any specific measures to reduce emission from that sector. That is regulated under the ETS system. Yeah, Canada asked us about public transportation and cycling. The Reykjavik city has taken a large step to improve the infrastructure for cycling, and that has improved very good measures to increase the cycling. And I've heard that my colleagues have made a laughing stock here that they said that they wanted to increase cycling in Iceland, but it has actually been so that there are more people that are cycling. And also the figures from the bus company in Reykjavik is showing us that people are more willing to take the bus, and that that's the main focus there. We will publish a figure on that in our biannual report, hopefully.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody willing to ask more questions. So colleagues, congratulations. We have just completed our morning session. So we are now suspending our meeting until 3 p.m. sharp. 3 p.m. sharp. And where we will have the opportunity to see and learn more from other countries, starting from Ireland. See you at 3. Thank you.